Humanity has always been at war with pain and suffering. Right? We have spent incredible amounts of time and energy and resources in an effort to try and overcome pain and suffering in our lives. And in many ways, we've been successful. Right? In many ways, we've accomplished a lot through intelligence and cooperation and diligence. We have created a world that is wildly different than the world of just a couple centuries past. Right? Wildly different. In the past, getting enough calories and clean water was a daily chore that took significant planning and physical effort to achieve. However, today, I'm willing to bet there's more of us that have to put time and energy into thinking about how we are going to burn the surplus calories that we consume, because we live in a world where pizza and cupcakes are abundant, right? Right, and so it's remarkably different. In the past, infant mortality was all too common of a tragedy. Some statistics that I looked up said that just a couple centuries ago, it was expected that 1 in 4 infants would die before a year old. Over half would die before they reached adulthood. Right, you're talking something, I can't even comprehend that. That means that in almost every family story, there would be a loss, a tragedy. I can't fathom that. Right? Due to modern advancements in medicine and our understanding of what brings about sickness, we've made infant mortality rare. Right? It's still tragic when it happens, but at least it's far rarer. Transportation and communication technologies have made it so that we can remain connected to our loved ones no matter where they are in the world. Right? It doesn't matter. It's no longer like the days of old where when your son or daughter left their hometown, they were absent from your life. Now we just pick up the phone, we give them a call, we give them a text, and if we're really lucky, we hop on a plane and we go pay them a visit. Right? So much has changed. In the past, the energy used to do work came from one primary source: muscle. Right? The energy to do work like grind grain or do laundry, man, that didn't come from the outlet. That came from human muscle and toil. And like today, those chores were never done. There was always more to do. It was just this treadmill of toil that people had to endure. And so I think it's really safe to say that if we were able to go back in time and to describe to somebody from that time period the wonders of the modern age, they would assume that this is a time of pleasure and leisure. And in many ways, it is. And yet, with all of that pleasure and leisure, they would be mistaken if they thought that pain and suffering had become a thing of the past. Right? After all, many of the things that they struggled with, many of the things that caused pain and suffering in their lives, man, we've overcome. And yet, as we've pulled away one layer of suffering, what we've discovered is that there's just another layer right underneath. Right? Even in this modern age, with all of our advancement, with all of our progress, we are still fully occupied by our suffering. Right? It is on the forefront of our minds at all times. I think that this is a really telling fact. Right? And it tells us that suffering is just a part of human nature, right? It's a part of the fall. It has little to do with our environment. Sure, a negative environment is going to induce more suffering than a positive one. But even in the midst of a pleasant and comfortable environment, right? All the details are good. The amount of suffering that a person can endure can be overwhelming. And I think that that's because it's not just about our physical needs and comforts. There is a spiritual component present in suffering, right? There's a spiritual component to suffering that we have to understand. There's a road that must be traveled. And that's what today's message is going to be about, is traveling this road of suffering and understanding what it is that God's seeking to do in us as we experience those times of difficulty. If you have your Bibles with you, I want to encourage you to open up to 2 Corinthians 12. We're going to start in this passage today, and in this passage, the Apostle Paul describes his struggle with suffering, and he describes how God uses that suffering to move Paul down the road of Christian maturity. And so God is going to use Paul's suffering in two ways. First, he's going to use Paul's suffering to make Paul more self-aware. Right? He's going to make Paul. He's going to bring Paul to a place where he understands the weaknesses that potentially could undermine his spiritual growth. And he's also, more importantly, God is going to use Paul's suffering to reveal himself to Paul in a very vivid and dramatic way, in a way that is life-changing and transformative to Paul. And so I want you to join me in verse 2. I think the screen is going to start on verse 1, but join me in verse 2 of chapter 12, 2 Corinthians. It says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Now, from this passage, we know that Paul is talking about himself, and that's going to become more clear as we move through the passage. Paul is attempting to be humble here. But he goes on and says, whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool because I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain. So no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassing great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In this passage of Scripture, Paul is expressing two realities that he has experienced side by side in his journey with the Lord. On the one hand, he has experienced the extraordinary, right? He has experienced divinely given revelations and visions that have marked his Christian journey. And with some of those visions, he's given us in detail. In Acts, we hear about the vision on the Damascus Road where Paul is entirely turned 160 degrees. He goes from being a persecutor of Christ to becoming a Christ follower. And then there's the vision that of the Macedonian man that totally changes the nature and direction of Paul's second missionary journey, right? Originally, Paul was going to circle around to the churches he had started on the first missionary journey, just kind of make the circuit in Asia Minor, but he doesn't keep that plan. He has this vision, and he decides to go north into Greece, and he preaches the gospel there. But this vision, right, whatever vision it is that Paul's talking about here, he's treating this vision with an entirely different level of reverence. This vision that he's referring to here, it is personal and it is intimate. And so in tandem with this experience of the extraordinary and this experience of having these revelations and this insight, in tandem with that, Paul also experiences a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. And that's pretty vivid. Right? That's pretty vivid description of the suffering that he was enduring. Since Paul wrote these words, there's been a great deal of speculation as to what this source of suffering was. Some believe that it was a physical ailment. Maybe it was malaria or tuberculosis. Can't say it. Many have said that his eyes were weak, that as he was growing older, he was becoming increasingly more blind. Others have even said it was epilepsy. Now, on the other side, people have suggested that, man, this wasn't a physical ailment at all, but the suffering that Paul is talking about, man, it was more spiritual or mental in nature, right? Perhaps it was a doubt or persistent temptation. Maybe Paul was tormented by the demonic, right? Maybe Paul was just constantly held down and discouraged by the constant criticism of other people. Right? The truth is that we don't know the exact nature of Paul's suffering. Right? We haven't been given those details. The details of the thorn in the flesh, that messenger of Satan, haven't really been given to us. But those are some pretty exciting descriptors. And I think Paul is using them intentionally. I think he calls it a thorn in the flesh because that indicates that what he's experiencing is physical. Right? It is real. It is happening in his day-to-day life. Paul's suffering, it isn't metaphorical. Right? It's legit. It's a part of his experience. It's constant and it's personal. And every day, every step, he feels that thorn digging in. Right? That's the image that we're supposed to get from that descriptor. That this is something that with every step of his day, he feels that suffering digging into his flesh. He calls it a messenger of Satan because even though it's physical in nature, it also has a spiritual aspect to it. Right? The setbacks and the discouragement of this life and the losses and the hurts of this world, those things become incredibly potent weapons in the hand of our adversary. Right? They become weapons that he wields to discourage us. He uses those weapons to cause us to doubt and to question and ultimately to erode our faith in God. Right? The enemy wants nothing more than to make you not trust your Creator. See, this is the role that suffering plays in the life of Paul, and this is often the effect that suffering has on us. Right? What starts as a physical suffering seeps over into the spiritual, and we find ourselves believing all kinds of painful lies and wrestling with powerful doubts about ourselves and about God. That's the thorn in the flesh. That's the messenger of Satan that Paul's talking about. And I think in the end, Paul is not precise about the details of his suffering because I don't think it matters. Right? I don't think his situation is really all that unique at all because every one of us experiences suffering and loss in this life, and that suffering and loss has the same effect on us as it did for Paul. Right? So our thorn in the flesh, our messenger of Satan, is still tormenting us, creating doubt and eroding our faith. That is our experience. Right? That is an experience that every Christian wrestles with as they live life in this world. Now, like Paul, you may have prayed earnestly that the suffering that you are experiencing would be taken away. And like Paul, that thorn has persisted. That is a difficult place to be. Right? We have this paradigm in our mind that if we do what's right and we ask God with all of our hearts, well, he's going to grant our wish. He's going to do what we want. But God's desires don't always line up with our desires. And so I know that there are many of you that you have prayed that the suffering that you've endured, that it would be pulled away from you, that God would alleviate it. And yet that thorn has persisted. And so if that's been your experience, I want to remind you of the rest of Paul's experience. Because God met him in his suffering and provided grace sufficient to sustain him and to uphold Paul, no matter whatever it was that he was experiencing. Like Paul's own words go further than this. And so I want to read them again because they are powerful, life-changing, transformative words. Listen to what he says. He says, "But he said to me," the he being God, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest in me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Right? Did you catch that? He delights in weakness. Right? He delights in the persecution. He delights in all of the hardships that he has to endure. Right? Paul goes so far as to say that what makes him weak is, in fact, what makes him strong. And the reason why he can say that is because it's those things that make him weak that finally led him to depend on God the way that he should. In a position of strength, he would have never gotten there. And so in our weakness, we come to God differently, right? In our weakness, the pretense of self-sufficiency, that's finally laid aside because we got nothing, right? We've come to the end of ourselves. We've come to the end of all of our tricks. We've come to the end of what this world has to offer. And finally, in that state, we're finally willing to look up to God and say, lead me. Show me the way out because I am lost. And when God leads us, often to our surprise, he does not lead us out of the suffering that we're experiencing. I wish he did. But that's often not the story that we have to tell. Sometimes it is. Some of you guys can share a vivid testimony of how God took you from a place of suffering and pulled you out of that. But oftentimes, God doesn't take us out of the suffering. He leads us through it. And as he leads us through it, he takes us down a road of transformation because that is God's true desire for us. God's true desire for us is not that we would live happy, comfortable, easy lives. God's desire for us is that we would be transformed into the likeness of his Son, that our character would be remolded to reflect his nature. And so this is the bottom line that I want us to grab today. And I want you to mark it down, circle it, and start it in your bulletin, because it is both a promise and a challenge. What the enemy intends to torment you, God can use to transform you. Right? Grab hold of that, church, because there's truth there. What the enemy wants to use to torment you, right? Whatever struggle it is you face, whatever difficulty you're up against, whatever loss that you're grieving, right? The enemy wants to use that to discourage you, to torment you, to cause you to question your faith. And God wants to use that same struggle to transform you, to draw you close to him, to mold you into the image of his Son. I want to put that on pause, and I want to take a moment and have a significant side conversation. I want to talk a little bit about pain and suffering, and in fact, what they are, because we often use those words interchangeably, but there's a difference. And you can have pain without suffering, and you can have suffering without pain. So let me first explain by defining the terms. The definitions I'm using come from the book entitled Between Pain and Grace. And in this book, pain is described as primarily objective, external, and typically social or physical as opposed to personal or mental. Suffering, on the other hand, is primarily subjective. It's internal, and it's typically mental or emotional as opposed to physical or social. Now, these two things can go together, right? The pain that we experience in this life, it can cause us to suffer. And the suffering that we experience in this life, there's many that have taken internal suffering and expressed that as outward pain, right? Whether that be through self-harm or just the body's materialization of that harm through physical pain. See, these two things often go together, but they don't have to. And I believe that we have a great deal of control over that as the ones experiencing those situations. And so first, let's talk about suffering without pain. In their book, Pain, The Gift Nobody Wants, I love that title because there's truth there, right? What we're going to discover is that pain is, in many ways, a gift given by God, but it is a gift that nobody wants, right? It is like peas on the dinner table. Just pass them along. We don't need it. So Dr. Paul Brand and Philip Yancey, they tell of a rare disease called congenital analgesia, or rather congenital insensitivity to pain. This disorder is characterized by a dramatically impaired perception of painful stimuli that leads to frequent trauma and self-mutilation. In his medical practice, Brand encountered a 4-year-old girl named Tanya, and her insensitivity to pain meant regularly repeated trauma to her body. Right? It started when she was in her crib as just a young infant. She bit off the tip of her finger and began to draw with the blood. Can you even imagine? Like the mother's first clue that something was wrong. Up until this time, Tanya had been an easygoing baby to take care of. I mean, she felt no pain. And so a lot of things that would cause discomfort and anger in the average toddler, infant, they didn't affect Tanya. But all of a sudden, the mother realized that there was something wrong. 7 years later, Dr. Brand received a call from Tanya's mother, and Brand reported that Tanya, now 11, was living a pathetic existence in an institution. Both of her legs had been amputated as she refused to wear proper shoes, and more importantly, she would not limp and she would not shift her weight because she never felt uncomfortable. And so as a result, her joints eventually gave out. Tanya had lost most of her fingers. Her elbows were constantly dislocated. She'd suffered the effects of chronic sepsis from ulcers in her hands and amputation stumps. See, here we encounter a rare and clearly tragic example of suffering without pain, or at least without physical pain. Now, how many of you ever thought, wouldn't it be nice to not have to feel pain? Well, this young girl had your wish, and it ruined her. Right? It caused immense amounts of suffering in her life because she didn't have that gift of pain. And so as hard as it is for us to accept, pain is a gift from God. Pain is a gift from God because it tells us that something is wrong. Right? It's telling us that something in the world around us is harming us, or maybe even harming the people near us. Right? Let's talk about the other side of that coin. Now, there can be suffering without pain. Just as there can be suffering without pain, so there can be pain without suffering. And this example is far less extreme and far more common to our experience. A gymnast preparing for the Olympics will invest long hours in training. They will end all unnecessary relationships and structure every hour of their time in strict training. Right? They will endure pain in the form of sore muscles and short-term failures and even minor injuries, all because they've got their eyes set on a goal. They're pursuing that gold, right? They want that Olympic gold, and so they pursue it. Similarly, a runner training for a marathon may log 60 miles in a week, maybe even 80. Right? Even if you're fast, that's a part-time job, you realize. Right? They will run and experience sore muscles and fatigue and even lose toenails. Now, last time I checked, that was a sign of torture, right? And yet they do it willingly without any idea that this is suffering because they have their mind set on a goal. And so long as there's good progress in the midst of it, all of that pain, all of that exhaustion, it's viewed as a pleasure. See, it's the meaning that the athletes assign to their pain that allowed them to consider it a stepping stone to victory and achievement rather than a cause of torment and suffering. Now, there are some mothers that have had the same experience as they endured the discomfort of pregnancy. Maybe even as they went through a painful and hard delivery, they considered all of that pain, all of that discomfort, it wasn't suffering because they lived in anticipation for the blessing that was going to be on the other side of it. See, it's the meaning that we assign to that pain that makes all the difference. Right? It's the gymnast, the runner, the woman in labor. The pain can be viewed as a means to a desired end, and therefore it's not seen as a threat, it's not seen as a torment, it's not seen as suffering. It's seen as a pathway towards something better. It's an issue of perspective. The pain that we must endure can be seen as a gift that God is using to transform us. Now, God uses that pain oftentimes to purge us of what's undesirable, and he uses that gift as a way to reveal himself to us and to unleash our full potential. And despite God's good intent, like I said, it's the gift nobody wants. It's the peas that you'd rather pass on. We often seek to avoid this pain because if given a choice, we don't want to go there. And if we were given that choice, it would not be to our benefit. In fact, I would argue that we often try to bypass pain all the time. And we reach to the coping mechanisms of this world in order to do that. See, pain cannot be avoided, but rather it must be moved through. And that's okay because God has a purpose for that pain. right? We got to stop looking for a way up and over or around pain, but instead trust God to lead us through it. And so the purpose of pain, there's two purposes that I want to outline for us. The first one is that pain makes us aware of sin and its effects. Again, pain tells us that something is wrong. Back to our illustration of Tanya, her suffering just grew and grew and grew because she didn't have pain telling her that something was wrong. The same thing would be true in our lives. If we were to live in this world and pain was not present, we would never understand the brokenness that sin was bringing into the world. Right? Pain is intended to tell us that something's wrong. Right? Pain is intended to cause us to take corrective action, to protect ourselves, or maybe even to display compassion to our brother or sister, or maybe even a stranger. Right? Pain is meant to motivate us into action. C.S. Lewis, in the classic work, The Problem of Pain, he writes this. He says, go ahead and throw that on the screen for them. This is what it says. It says, now error and sin both have this property, that the deeper they are, the less their victim suspects their existence. They are masked evil. Pain is unmasked, unmistakable evil. Every man knows that something is wrong when he is being hurt. See, we talked about this last week. We said, like sheep, we have been led astray. Right? And we talked about how Jesus came and he paid the price for our sin. He suffered for our benefit because we were all led astray. And the same thing is true here. We need to recognize that all of us have been left off course away from God's will. And this produces brokenness in this world. It produces brokenness in our lives. And often we are completely unaware of this brokenness. Pain tells us to look for something deeper, right? Pain tells us to go seeking for something more. In many ways, we can think of ourselves as a drug addict that has their hands full of toys and pleasures, right? In this drunken or high state, there's a sort of freedom from pain, right? But the problem is that you cannot grow, right? You cannot become better. However, that momentary pleasure, it hides a growing brokenness, right? Physical and mental deterioration, relationship neglect and betrayal, wasted potential and resources. See, all of these things can exist in the addict's life until their life becomes so unmanageable as the brokenness begins to just consume them. And it drives them to initiate a change. Now, I am using that illustration not because I want to highlight the folly of those that struggle with addiction. No, I think they deserve our compassion. But I do want us to recognize that the metaphor is true of all of us. Right? I've seen people make their lives unmanageable as they overly invest in work and success, right? As they start pursuing that mighty dollar because they think that that's going to spare them the suffering that they feel or get them out of the suffering that they're experiencing. I've watched others who have who Netflix and game themselves into an unmanageable life because they just want to be numb from the pain and the suffering that they're experiencing. And so they just dive into a false world and they neglect the world around them until their life is completely unmanageable. See, we seek to avoid pain and suffering, and to this end, we inevitably, every one of us, turns to worldly answers to numb and to distract us. If it were not for pain, we would be content in that state. But it is pain and suffering that comes into our life that rouses us, that makes our life unmanageable and enables us to put aside the coping mechanisms of this world in search of something better. See, every one of us has come to know Christ because we experience pain. Right? We experience suffering. We witness something in this world that brought us to the realization that this world is broken and I need something more. And so the Lord met us in that place and we came into a relationship with him. C.S. Lewis, he goes on and he writes what is quite possibly his most famous quote. He says this, he says, "We can rest contentedly in our sins and our stupidities." I love how he doesn't pull any punches. We can rest contentedly in our sins and our stupidities. And anyone who has watched gluttons shoveling down the most exquisite food as if they did not know what they were eating will admit that we can ignore even pleasure. But pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. See, pain is a gift because it makes us aware of our need. I would argue that pain is also a gift because pain calls us to put down the things of this world in favor of the things of God. Another quote from C.S. Lewis. I know I'm cheating. I'm just stringing C.S. Lewis quotes. But he literally wrote the book, right? So this is what he says. He says, if the first and lowest operation of pain shatters the illusion that all is well, the second shatters the illusion that what we have, whether good or bad in itself, is our own and enough for us. Everyone has noticed how hard it is to turn our thoughts to God when everything is going well with us. We have all we want is a terrible saying when all does not include God. We find God in interruption. As St. Augustine says somewhere, God wants to give us something but cannot because our hands are full. There is nowhere for him to put it. Now I want to hit pause here. I want us to make sure we don't misunderstand this point. I don't want you to think for a moment that God is turning up the temperature, turning up the volume on pain in your life because he wants to have a deeper relationship with you. I don't think that's the way it works at all. I think pain and suffering is just the result of living in this broken world, right? Oftentimes, the actions that we, our pursuit of pleasure, our pursuit of selfishness, these things bring suffering and pain into our lives. And so God doesn't have to dial it up until we finally turn to him. He just sits there waiting for us to respond to what's already present in our lives. And so an illustration that came on me this morning, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but over all of my years of youth ministry, I've noticed one thing about teenagers. It doesn't matter how cold it is, they don't want to wear a coat. Right? That doesn't make sense to me, right? But that's the truth. They will go from house to car, and they will suffer in the car. They will go from the car into whatever school or whatever they're going to next. And inevitably, there comes that time when they get stuck out in the cold, right? And they don't have a coat. And I think the analogy that I want us to grab hold of here is oftentimes we are that teenager, right? We are out in the cold, suffering, feeling the cool breeze. And God is offering us the coat, and we are stubbornly refusing to take it from him. Stubbornly refusing to acknowledge him because, man, it would mess up our style, right? It's too bulky. I don't want to carry it around. Whatever the reasons that motivate teens to do that, what suffering and pain eventually does is it makes us say, you know what? I think I need that. And it changes our mind. In the midst of our suffering, God is offering us relationship. And that relationship in the midst of suffering can take on a profoundly intimate and personal nature. See, when the things of this world have proven themselves to be insufficient, or when those things have been ripped from our hands, we often experience God in an entirely different way. I witnessed this beautifully in the life of a friend. She went through a divorce that she did not want. And that divorce left her feeling betrayed, unloved, insecure about her future, and profoundly alone. And as she moved through the pain and suffering of that transition in her life, she experienced her relationship with Jesus on an entirely different level, in an entirely different way. See, all of the things that mattered most to her, all the things that she had built her identity around, being a wife and a mother, all of those things were gone, or at a minimum, they were changed to such an extent that triggered in her a crisis of belief. And in that crisis of belief, she faced a choice. Right? She could run away from Jesus, or she could grab hold of him in absolute desperation. I've watched people do both. Right? I've seen it when the most committed Christian, right? The person that you thought had it rock solid, man, they come up against suffering, and in the midst of that suffering, they start to run away from God, right? They're disillusioned, they're angry, they're frustrated, they're disappointed, and so that becomes the excuse to just abandon it. I've witnessed that. And I've also witnessed the other extreme, where someone who's never set foot in the church before in their lives, all of a sudden, in the midst of hardship and grief, they grab a hold of Jesus with an urgency, a desperation that leaves them forever transformed. My friend chose the latter. Right? And as a result of that, she experienced a depth of relationship and intimacy with Jesus that she had never known before. One day, as she was talking with me and a number of others about this, she was trying to describe her experience. And she described it this way. She said, "I feel like I'm slow dancing with Jesus." That image became the metaphor for her movement through grief. I understand that was in no way a easy dance. Right? That was in no way a fun dance. That was a dance full of tears. But amid those tears, my friend held on to Jesus. And Jesus held on to her. And step by step, his grace became sufficient for her. Right? Step by step, in that beautiful dance, her weakness became strength. See, church, I want us to grab hold of this. Right? What the enemy wants to use to torment you, God can use to transform you. That is meant to be all of our stories. Right? Donovan shared the scripture just a few minutes ago that says, man, in this world you will what? You will have trouble. Suffering is coming, pain is coming, death hunts us all. And so in the midst of that, we can let the enemy torment us with that, or we can allow God to transform us through it. But to see that realized in our lives, we have to grab hold of Jesus. Right? We have to grab hold so tightly and trust him. No matter what it is that we are experiencing, man, we don't let go. Right? We need to see our pain through spiritual eyes. Because ultimately, what matters most isn't going to be what we've lost. It isn't going to be what we've endured. The only thing that's ever going to matter in eternity, the only thing that's going to endure, is what God has accomplished through it. See, God redeems our suffering. I know we often feel abandoned in it, but God redeems our suffering. God alone can take death and make life. God alone can take the ashes and destruction of a broken life and create something magnificent and beautiful. But to see it realized, we have to be willing to let go of the things of this world. Grab hold of Jesus and trust him to lead us not around, not under, not over, but through suffering and pain that we experience in our lives. Now, having said that, I also want to just recognize it's not an easy journey, right? Because just underneath our suffering, there's shame, there's guilt, there's fear, there's anger, right? You're going to face every one of those things. And those are turbulent waters that frankly, we don't know how to traverse on our own. And so it's only God that's going to get us there. You cannot willpower yourself through pain and suffering. You have to fall desperately into the arms of Jesus. And so that's my challenge to you today. Is that in the midst of whatever it is that you experience, that you would trust that God is in the midst of it, that you would allow him to make you self-aware, address your sin, address the sin that's around you. But most importantly, recognize that God is trying to reveal himself to you in a deeply personal and intimate way. My challenge to you is that we would all slow dance with Jesus. That would be our story.